Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Why don't we get started? Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Michael Auslin. I'm a resident scholar here and the director of Japan Studies, and we're very glad that all of you have joined us today for a panel that I think is going to be instructive. It's going to be very timely. We have so much expertise, not only up here at the dais, but looking out at the audience. We could have had 4 or 5 panels filled with folks who know this issue. But as we in Washington deal with the question, the sort of pressing questions of ISIS, with Iran negotiations, questions of still what's going on in Syria, and that sense that global order is weakening before our eyes. Sometimes we don't look quite as much, I would argue, at the Pacific as is warranted. In comparison to much of Eurasia, it seems relatively stable and relatively peaceful. We know there are problems there. Just yesterday, North Korea apparently launched off 7 short-range missiles, showing yet again that it maintains its desire both to complicate things in the region, but also press forward with its ability to perfect these types of technology. We know there are lots of issues with China. Last week, China announced that it was increasing its defense budget again by double digits, 10%, even as it has revised downward its growth estimates, economic growth estimates, to 7%, so sending certain signals on what it thinks are the most important things for its national interests. But again, by comparison, much of Washington thinks you can put Asia on the back burner. One of the reasons we do that, of course, is because we have a robust and deep and decades-long alliance system in Asia that is, next to, of course, NATO, something that's very unique. It allows us entry into the region and a presence and an ability to interact with different states in the region in a way that we find ourselves wanting, certainly in other areas, if you think of Africa and if you think of parts of Eurasia or even Latin America. At the core of that alliance system is Japan and South Korea, where we have had troops forward-based for decades, where we have had an ongoing and robust set of negotiations and decisions on how to make these alliances work over the generations, something which is relatively historically anomalous. There's no book for how you keep an alliance system going for generations after it was originally put together. So we look at this alliance system as the underpinnings of what we do in Asia, and in many ways it is. But there are problems. And the problem is one of the things that we're here to discuss today. What we should have been doing today is having a celebration of 50 years of the normalization of relations between the Republic of Korea and Japan, turning a page on their history, their tragic history, having formed a relationship of 2 democratic, liberal nations allied to the United States that are beginning to set the patterns for how Asia, Northeast Asia, East Asia will develop into the future. That's what we should be doing today. And unfortunately, we're not. And one of the reasons you're all here is because we know that we're actually going to talk about just the opposite of what we hope to talk about. We're going to talk instead about why, after 50 years of normalization, 70 years after the war, South Korea and Japan have a parlous state of relations and tensions that are probably as high as they've ever been since normalization in 1965. I think many in Washington think this is certainly the last world that we wanted to be in as we try to link together our alliances closer. And I would venture to say that both Seoul and Tokyo would not have either wanted or predicted necessarily this outcome. But we're here. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And there is really no better panel that I can think of to put together to talk about this issue, those who have worked it directly for decades, those who have thought about it and written about it for decades, and of course, all of you in the audience, many of you who as well have worked on it. You do have bio sheets, so I'm not going to spend too much time introducing our panelists, but I do just want to mention them. thank them for taking time out of what I know is extraordinarily busy schedules for all of them to come and share with us their views on this issue. Starting down farthest from me, though not politically and ideologically, is Kurt Campbell, the president of Asia Group, the former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs in the State Department, also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, someone that everyone in the room knows very well. Next to him is Richard Lawless, the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, which is now the Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Asia and Pacific, so stretching from Japan all the way to Afghanistan, Pakistan. Someone with decades of experience, both operationally as well as at the policy level, and currently heading up the New Magellan Ventures Consulting, which is really at the forefront of many of the next generation issues for trade and technology development in the region. Coming closer is Victor Cha, the chair of Korean Studies and also as associate professor of political science. Professor, I'm sorry, as a former professor, I know we got to get those right. Professor of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, former National Security Council staffer, writer on all issues Korea, and with a most recent book on North Korea. And then my colleague Nick Eberstadt, whom everyone knows, working on demographic issues, on political development issues, and of course on Korean issues here at the American Enterprise Institute. So really a panel unparalleled in their knowledge and experience in the region. What we wanted to do today was not have a set of formal presentations. In fact, if you can mentally erase this table here, imagine us all sitting in wing chairs in front of a fire. We're going to have a fireside chat about the issues. And I'm going to be, as the moderator, just driving this discussion, which hopefully will be just as engaging for you as I know it will be for us. And so I'm actually going to kick it off with Richard, if I can, looking at really a unique perspective that you have, Richard, operationally, policy-wise, and now from a business perspective. I'd like to ask you two questions, if I can, to kick us off. The first one is, so we called this because we're worried about the state of relations between Japan and Korea. We think they are suboptimal at best. Are we wrong in that? Is there a lot more good news that's out there that we just don't know? And if so, can you talk to us about it? Or are we really in a very parlous situation? And then secondly, we pitch this as Japan-Korea. And so we think of it as a two-player dynamic, but it's not just two players. There are other players, us above all, the Chinese, North Korea. So how do we expand our frame of reference to think about the Korean-Japanese relationship in that larger perspective?
Sorry. Well, first of all, thank you for pulling this panel together. It's very appropriate that we do so on the 50th anniversary and that we sort of take stock as to where these relationships are. That is the relationship between those two countries and I think the relationship between the United States as it has attempted to play alliance manager in both of these alliances that we have. To answer your first question, and I think it's very timely, while I wouldn't agree that the situation is as perilous or as difficult as it may have been in the past, particularly I think we had some real low points in our relationship management activity under the Nomuhyun government in Korea, for example. To me, the thing that characterizes the current tensions is this should be a time when relationships are good, or at least trending positive in the dynamic of these two countries. We really have two administrations that should be able to work together, that have some time ahead of them, or had time ahead of them a couple of years back when they both began. And one would have hoped that we would be at a different point in the relationship, and in fact we are not. For someone like myself who spends a lot of time in the region interacting with folks in both countries, what stands out to me is the fact that tensions and sensitivities remain skin deep. Everyone is sensitive to what everyone else has to say. Offense is taken very eagerly and, if not enthusiastically. And we really have a dynamic that I don't think has much chance to improve in the next couple of years. And I say that with a lot of, not with hesitation, but with no small amount of sorrow, because I think the character and the structure of both of the administrations makes it difficult for compromises to be reached and the right things to be said, and it makes it difficult for particularly the Korean side of the equation to say the right things when they should be said. And I'll be willing to dive into that in a little bit more depth, but there are some inhibitions on both sides now that I think set the tenor and the character for what we're probably going to experience over the next 2 years. And to answer your second question, it is indeed with this theme going into the next few months that I think we're entering a really interesting period. We will this summer, of course, not only experience the end of the Second World War as we celebrate it and as the Koreans celebrate it with, in their words, the lifting of darkness or the burst of light. I believe it's Hanbok-chon, and they celebrate the 15th of August. And how that is memorialized in Korea and how that is memorialized here and what is said at that time is very important. But there are other players in the region, and the other players in the region are determined to insert themselves into these relationships and play a role. And to my mind, the key player here that is attempting to assert itself with some degree of success is China. China sees, to me, an opportunity here to devolve the situation and build a stronger relationship with the Republic of Korea. And in fact, that appears to be part of the strategy of the Xi Jinping government. And I think that they are succeeding to some degree. Again, this probably involves a lot more discussion and a lot more detail. But coming back to my theme about the end of the war, as many of you know, China celebrates the end of the war on the 2nd of September, the date that the Japanese instrument of surrender was signed on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. How that event is celebrated, much in the same way that Vladimir Putin celebrated victory in Europe Day, VE Day, in Europe, and how people were pulled together at that time and what is said at that time among the parties that might be called together, I think is very important. So we have some important dates that we have to transition through over the next few months, and we need to watch this carefully, and there has to be, I think, some restraint on the part of all the parties involved. Not only Japan, because the finger is so often pointed at Japan for not, quote, doing what it should be doing, but we also have to believe that the PAC government in Republic of Korea has to channel and restrain itself as to what it says and what it does in the coming months, and it's incumbent upon them to do so, I believe, for their own national interests. And I think we also have to be finally mindful of the role of both China and Russia in the equation going forward. So with those comments, I'll conclude.
Richard, thank you. So, Kurt, it wasn't too long ago that you were dealing with this directly, shuttling back and forth, and you're still there all the time. What went wrong, or why didn't? How much are we to not to blame, but did we do what we could have? Not just when you were there, but over this long run, to get us to a different point today. Are we irrelevant to that process because these are deep and emotional and national issues that have to be worked out between Seoul and Tokyo, with a bit of the perspective now that you've stepped back for the past couple of years? How do you assess both where the relations are, but also what we did or didn't do?
Thank you, Misha. Let me join with Richard in thanking you also for putting together this great team. I'm looking forward to hear what Nick and Victor have to say. I like Nick's leather jacket. I wore my leather pants, but you can't see them beneath the desk here. So it's great to be here. And Misha, I particularly appreciate your writings on this topic. I would associate myself with what Richard has already said. I like your question about what is the role of the United States in this. And I would say, generally speaking, I think the conventional wisdom historically has been that to get involved more directly risks the U.S. reputation in one or both capitals, right? And I think that has been quite an abiding belief on both sides of the political aisle in the United States. To be perfectly honest, I would question that assumption increasingly, and I believe that particularly as relations have deteriorated, and I share Richard's concern here, it's not so much that they are tensions, but irritations and hurt feelings that at a moment's notice can flare. I believe as that process has continued, accelerated, and actually spread to other parts of society and government, I think it calls into question whether the United States can and should be doing more. So I would simply say that I think ultimately one of the challenges is at the diplomatic and the security and intelligence level, the two countries actually are getting along quite fine. They don't often want to be seen in public together, but in terms of actual workmanlike relations and cooperation, it's quite substantial. But oftentimes, one or the other will say, look, this was a great meeting, but let's not talk about it in public, right? At its fundamental level, this is a political dispute that is multifaceted, that actually requires political leadership on both sides. Now, I would say, I'll just put this out here as something to discuss. The United States is often deeply, profoundly ambitious globally, right? We've been on a profound search for a deal with Iran. We have been working for decades on what we hope will be a two-state solution in the Middle East. I'd like to see some of that ambition and ingenuity, frankly, applied to some of the problems that we're facing in Northeast Asia. For instance, I believe if at a high-level political commitment, if the United States said, look, we are determined to bring our two closest friends in the world more closely together, I believe we could accomplish it. Frankly, I think we could accomplish that more than some of these other initiatives that we're involved in. And personally, I would like to see a much more sustained American political commitment to that effort. I like that the president met with the two leaders in The Hague, but that is not sufficient. More needs to be done. Now, I would suggest to you, I think we need to be taking steps that basically turns these into incredibly important bilateral relationships, that increasingly there are dimensions to them that allow for almost a trilateralization of both, so that there are more commitments that are taken on that are shared between the two countries. Personally, I think it is achievable to imagine a circumstance where at the political level, all three countries sign on to something that's close to a collective security agreement. I think that is extremely difficult and ambitious, but if a president of the United States said, look, this is the direction that we're going to go, we're in the 21st century, these are our two closest friends, attack on any of us is an attack on all of us. I think that would go a long way in helping create the kind of political environment in which underneath it some of the exchanges and engagements could flourish more directly. So I would put myself squarely in the camp, and this is a very substantial minority, I recognize it, that says the United States can and should do more. And the idea that if we inject ourselves, that we're going to make the situation worse, I'm not sure how the situation can get much worse. And frankly, I think to have two friends quarreling like this for such a substantial period of time really calls into question what is a friend for if it's not for helping two other friends work more constructively together. So I would like a much more activist engagement here. And I agree on some level that it is China is playing a very dynamic role now in terms of both its very negative attitudes on Japan and cultivating a closer relationship with South Korea. Personally, I have great confidence in South Korea. I think that an improvement in relationship between South Korea and China is in our best strategic interest, because I think sooner rather than later, when China starts to really fundamentally understand that they've bet on the wrong Korea and that they have the wrong Korea as a friend, I think that's better for all concerned. And so, in fact, if you really want to disappoint a Chinese friend, tell them how much you welcome the relationship between Seoul and Beijing, because it runs so contrary to what they expect. But fundamentally, it is in our best strategic interest. The real problem is not China developing a closer relationship with South Korea. It is the absence of a better relationship between South Korea and Japan that is the real worry, not what China is doing with respect to its ambitious diplomacy in Northeast Asia. Thank you, Misha.
So let me put you back then in your policy hat, or put the policy hat back on. If you wanted to, as you said, apply that ambition and that energy to solving or trying to solve this problem, how do you do it? Do you do it with the grand gesture, the Camp David style approach, and bring them together and make it a very public issue, or do you do it step by step, slowly? As you said, there's already stuff going on behind closed doors. Because we've tried that, at least to some level, and it's been slow, but we see where we are today. Whenever we talk about the grand gesture, we know that both of our partners there get very nervous because they're not ready domestically. They haven't had those domestic discussions. So to put your policy hat back on, how do you do it?
Great, and it's a good question, and I agree with those who say that if you actually thrust senior leaders in a room in which the necessary prerequisite work has not been done, that's very dangerous for all concerned, and I agree with that. I think as a first step, well, first of all, there's a number of things that can be done. The general approach that the United States has taken to date is to do things deeply beneath the surface, right? And I understand that. But I actually think that you reach a stage where that is counterproductive. That in fact it is the visibility of the American engagement that actually lends credence to that it is in the American strategic interest to mend this rift. So as a first step, I would think very carefully of a senior person, and this is a political problem. This is so this is hard to be solved by diplomats or military people. This is a political problem. So someone with deep political chops and respect would be asked to essentially travel. What's that term called when you go back and forth? I'm sorry. Shuttle, excuse me, a little senior moment there. Shuttle back and forth between South Korea and Tokyo, between Seoul and Tokyo for an extended period, simply listening and expressing our public desire to see communication improve and the dynamics, so that there is a visible sign that the United States cares about this and believes it's important. And I think that sort of ginning of the system actually could be remarkably helpful and create space in both countries. And if it is seen in both societies in the region that the United States is committed to this and committed to this process of improving political dialogue, that could help substantially. And then you would work collectively to open these lines of communication. Both sides have ideas, and then the key is really to facilitate the exchange of those and to put the substantial weight of the United States behind a process in which these are allowed to be discussed more openly in both societies. And I think the ultimate goal should be a high-level engagement of some kind, but there has to be the preliminary work, and that preliminary work has to be undertaken at the highest levels in the U.S. government so that they understand that it's not just Seoul and Tokyo that are taking the risks, but the United States as well. We're taking a risk. We're putting our substantial diplomatic, staying power and reputation on the table, and that you don't want us to be hurt either in this, do you? So let's work together.
I want to come back to this idea about the U.S. because I think it's important, and we've got policymakers here, past and future, and so I'm going to come back to that. But before we get too much and make this what should the U.S. do? I want to draw us back into the countries. So Victor, initially I was going to ask you something. Put on your NSC hat and say, okay, state's got the idea now. How does NSC run with that or not? But
It should be an NSC person, not a state person.
it should be an NSC person. So already we've got our own bureaucratic policy.
Let's keep it secret from the State Department. Yeah.
So we'll hold that for just a second. But I'd like to go back into the society. So what Kurt is talking about in this attempt that puts U.S. Visibility behind it, shuttling, which is interesting. I'm not sure, maybe except Camp David, I don't know when we've actually shuttled between two friends. I mean, we're often shuttling between partners and semi-partners. So that alone is an interesting dynamic. But what is the state inside South Korea today, the state of play in terms of a national discussion talking about this? Where are we for the South Koreans to start thinking about that next generation, what they want out of a relationship with Japan, and then to the extent that you want to also talk about the Japan side?
Well, thanks, Misha, and I echo everybody's sentiments on the panel. It's really a great idea to pull this together, and very timely. And it's really a pleasure to be on the panel with such a wonderful group of people. I guess the first thing I would say is that, in Korean there's this term han, right, which means, unredeemed resentment for past injustices. I talked about this at a conference in New York once, and this lady came up to me afterwards and she said, I've been married for 25 years to a Korean, and she wasn't Korean, and she goes, now I get it. Now I understand what you're talking about. Yeah, and she's still married to him. Yeah. He's sitting on the other side of the room, though. So, and so that has always been there, and that always pervades the Korean mindset when it comes to Japan. And that can explain a lot of what we see both on the street and at the elite level when it comes to attitudes towards Japan today as well as in the past. And on the Japanese side, I think traditionally it's been more indifference and in some cases ignorance about the history and about the past, and that just makes the Koreans more angry. But then more recently it has gone from ignorance or indifference to a much more proactive negative sentiment towards Korea. And that probably is the thing that has changed the most, I think, when we talk about the situation today. I do want to say that, picking up on something that Richard said at the beginning, is that I know we're in a very bad period right now, and the fact that Kurt even is putting out ideas like an envoy, I think, is reflective of how bad the situation is right now. But I would also emphasize that if we look at this over the longer period of time, like going back 50 years, and if we look at this given the difficult historical relationship, there's been a lot more cooperation in this relationship than conflict, and I think people tend to forget that. I mean, in fact, it's kind of amazing that these two countries have been able to manage over the past 50 years, despite some of the things that have happened between them. And whether you're talking about the Kim Dae-jung kidnapping or the Moon Se-kwang assassination attempt that killed Park Chung-hee's wife, I mean, these were really bad times in the relationship. There are probably people in the room who remember that better than I. And the relationship has recovered from that. So I think we are in a very bad period, but if we look at the broader perspective, I mean, I think overall for the past 50 years, it's been more positive than negative. And eventually we recover, right? Eventually the relationship recovers. But when we take this slice of time, obviously it's quite bad. The thing that concerns me the most on the Korean side these days is we talk about this being the 50th anniversary, the 70th anniversary, the opportunity to move forward, as you said, Misha. Abe's appointed his panel for his historical remarks. They seem like a pretty moderate group. The thing, quite frankly, that worries me on the Korean side, and I'm going to get all my Korean friends in the room upset now, is that I don't think the Koreans want to give Japan a chance this year. I mean, this is the 50th anniversary, yes, the 70th anniversary, and everybody is focused on what Abe is going to say. But I don't think there's a sentiment right now in Korea that wants to give him a chance, that wants to say, or that sees this as an opportunity not to allow Japan off the hook, right? We look at the 50th anniversary, 70th anniversary. If he says the right things, maybe we can move forward. And I think in many ways we've reached the point where it's so zero-sum that nobody wants to give him that opportunity. I mean, I think in part because of obviously the long history, but in part because it's Abe, right? And they probably don't think, regardless of what he says, that he believes what he says. And so why let him off the hook, right? Especially on this particular year. And I think that's a very bad sentiment. It's not productive, but I'm afraid that we're seeing more of that. The other thing is that this is clearly, from a South Korean perspective, this is not in their interests. I mean, there's a narrative that we all know in Washington, in part focused on what's happening between Japan and Korea, where there's a perception that Korea is slowly but quietly falling into China's orbit. I don't think that's true personally. I think all the outreach to China has nothing to do with Japan and has everything to do with North Korea and trying to move the needle in China with regard to North Korea. But that's not the perception, right? The perception is that you put together this antagonism towards Japan with the outreach towards China, and it looks like they're sliding into China's orbit. And that's not in South Korean national interest. It is not in their diplomatic interest. It's not in their national interest. I like Kurt's idea of an envoy of some sort. I mean, I think the most important message that envoy can send, and it's not a new one, is that the difficulties in the bilateral relationship are harmful. The difficulties in the Japan-ROK bilateral relationship are harmful to U.S. bilateral relations with Korea and U.S. bilateral relations with Japan. So they're interested in strengthening the bilateral relationship with the United States. One of the best ways they can do that is to improve their own bilateral and trilateral relationship. I do think that on the Korean side, no one's proposed this idea yet, but if it were proposed on the Korean side, the one sensitivity would be how they would distinguish an effort that was aimed at trying to improve the bilateral relationship from an effort that was trying to create a strategic triangle that was targeted at China, right? I mean, this is naturally the sort of reaction you get in Korea to things of this nature. But I think that shuttle, what is it that you can, that can be triangulated, in some format, and so I think it's a good idea.
So a phrase that you hear a lot in Tokyo today, unfortunately, is Seoul fatigue.
Yeah.
This attempt that the Japanese perceive they've made, Abe's made, to reach out to President Park to try and get beyond where the state of relations are, not least of which because of that fear and concern of isolation, of really looking at what Xi Jinping is doing and realizing this is most likely for the next 8 years now going to be an assertive regime at a minimum, maybe an aggressive regime, but one that quite frankly we can't yet fully anticipate how it will evolve. Xi is going to be already is a different style Chinese leader than what we've seen over the past couple of leaders. And I think that feeds into this Japanese sense of wanting to have some of its ducks lined up in a row, yet not receiving the reciprocity. So let me bring it back then, if I can, to what you mentioned very interestingly, that you think the Korean outreach, the ROK outreach to PRC, to China is actually about North Korea. It's not about Japan. So from the Japanese perspective then, how do you interpret things like the Harbin Museum, that China created for the assassination of Ito Hirobumi, Japanese prime minister in 1909, that the South Koreans have supported, have made a big tourist focus and attraction. Is it sort of incidental damage? Meaning, if Seoul is really looking to Beijing about the Pyongyang issue, then we have to tone down our own concern about some of these types of things that they're doing, because it's really not about Japan. But certainly from Tokyo's perspective, they look at this and say, we're back a century to where we were.
Yeah.
And so you've lost ground.
Yeah. So a couple of things. First, on Korea fatigue, I agree with you 100%. I mean, that's really what's changed on the Japanese side. It's that whether you're talking about the media, the politicians, and even the officials, that there is Korea fatigue, and that's the thing that I think is the hardest to turn around, because when Japanese decision making and opinion moves in one direction, it's very hard to move. It takes time, but it's hard to move back, and that's where I think the role of the United States could actually be quite important in terms of that particular aspect, to help to try to dissipate the Korea fatigue in Tokyo. On Harbin Museum and some of these other things, see, my sense is that when the Koreans interact with the Chinese bilaterally, I think 90% of the agenda is how do we sort of try to change China's strategic calculation on the peninsula, right? It's all about, the FTA, the NSC dialogues, the personal relationship between Xi and Park. That's what it's about. And whenever the Chinese start talking about history issues, I mean, at least my impression from the conversations that I've had is that they are very careful. They're very careful privately, and they try to be careful publicly, but sometimes it slips out. So, but I think my understanding is that essentially the position is, China, you have your view on history, we have our view on history, but we consider this a bilateral issue with Japan. We don't need to pile on with anybody on that. And there are moments where that doesn't work, like when Xi Jinping gave his speech in Korea at a university. It was all about history. And I think, quite frankly, the Koreans were embarrassed by that, because my understanding was that they were not given an advance copy of the speech, so they didn't know exactly what was coming out, and they weren't very happy with it. Now, at the same time, you can point to things like Harbin, which was a proposal that had been out there, I guess, for a while, and the Chinese suddenly jumped on it and became very enthusiastic about it. But at least my understanding of it is that they try to be quite careful on being seen as piling on with China on the history issue. Now, again, having said that, there's no denying that there's a perception, particularly here in Washington, that Korea is sort of sliding, ever so slowly, gradually sliding into the China orbit. And that, I think, has as much to do with perceptions about the relationship with Japan than it does anything that's happening in the South Korea-China bilateral relationship. And so that, to me, is concerning. It's one of the big negative externalities for South Korean diplomacy. One of the big negative externalities for the diplomacy when it comes to this Japan-Korea problem.
So, Nick, Victor's teed up the history question for us, and both as historians. I'm wondering if you would look a little bit, or talk to us a little bit about the generational issue. We've had countries in dyadic relationships that have had terrible histories and have overcome that in the 20th century, not only as American allies, but then have themselves formed cores for their regions that have moved politics and security and human rights and all sorts of issues forward. That's what we want to see. That's what we like. Obviously, Europe is our prime example there. Do you have any thoughts on comparing and looking at these two instances and the generations, and why you don't have that evolution in either the Japan-Korea side, let alone when they look and they see what opportunities are out there?
Misha, that's a hugely important question. I'm really glad. It's a hugely important question, and I'm really glad you asked it. I mean, another way to frame it would be something like this. What is the difference between an interwar period and a post-war period? How can you tell whether you're in an interwar period or in a post-war period? Well, there are a lot of different factors, right? But one is the factor that Kurt got at. One is the quality of leadership on the parts of various governments and various statesmen. I mean, you go back and look at the European interwar period, and there have been libraries written on all of this stuff. But in a way, I think the guy who got it best was a poet. It was named W.H. Auden. He's got a poem about the low dishonest decade.
1939.
Thank you. Very good. Exactly. Bear that in mind. And compare 1939 to 1945 in Europe, okay? No historical analogies are perfect, and they're full of flaws, and I realize that when I suggest them, but just look at it as a thought experiment, let's say, instead of an analogy. Let's say we have two countries, and we'll call them, for the sake of argument, France and Germany. And let's say these two countries had, three wars, three big, brutal, bloody wars in the past century. And let's say one of these countries had occupied and economically colonized another one of those countries for a while. And let's say, we won't call it a comfort woman problem, but let's say it was called horizontal collaboration. There were a lot of reasons for impossible grievances that couldn't be overcome. And yet, those grievances were overcome. And history was put behind. And a new order was created. And how did this happen? There were a lot of reasons, but one of the critical reasons was the quality of leadership. And you can't write the story for the success of post-war Europe without involving that quality of leadership, without the Adenauers and the Robert Schumans and, in other countries like the de Gasperys and even the Churchills, people like that. And, look at what was done by people who wanted to get history behind them, and you have to stand in awe today looking at this. Which is to say that with leadership, as Kurt was saying, maybe even with local leadership, great changes could be made from the situation we are in. And not to put too fine a point on it, the security architecture of Asia, and even of Northeast Asia, is not complete yet. It is not complete yet. We have not dealt with the unification of the Korean Peninsula. We have not dealt with the question of unified Korea's future, whether it will be a member of a democratic, prosperous international security order or not. We've not dealt with the whole question of how we truly bring together a multilateral security network, a solid, stable one of the sort that we have been so blessed to create in Europe. All of that requires leadership. And in a way, it seems to me we're kind of waiting for the leadership.
I want to turn to, because I don't want to leave us, today before we get to questions with no hope at all. We want to turn to ideas and thoughts about what we can do. Kurt has actually started us down that path. But I actually want to pick up this point, Nick, just for a second. We've talked about the failures, in essence, of the past generations. All you guys are deeply involved in the region. You go there, you know people, you're talking to them all the time. How do you feel about the next generation? Do you have any hope, either at that leadership level that Nick was just talking about, or maybe the broader level, the broader social level of maybe there's fatigue with fatigue. Maybe, the Japanese, I think, would be very happy to get rid of this problem and move to a new relationship. I think the Koreans would probably welcome it under the right circumstances. So maybe people are getting tired of being at odds, which is one of the classic ways that essentially internecine wars end. People just get tired of fighting. Do you have any hope for that on the ground? Do you see anybody? Is there anything that you say, 10 years from now, I think we're going to be in a different situation? Richard?
Well, to address Nick's issue of leadership and the requirement for leadership, but also to roll in on Victor's comments with regard to the fundamental attitude of the Korean government and the Korean people as to where we are right now on the 50th anniversary, which, by the way, I totally associate myself with. There is actually a real continuity here because Victor mentioned that he doesn't believe that we're in a position right now in Korea where the Korean mentality at any level is prepared to meet the Japanese halfway or, quote, let them off the hook during this coming few-month period of time or in the near term. That's an issue of attitude, but it's also an issue of flexibility. The fact of the matter is that we are the hostage to our fathers, and wherever we are in this generational transition, President Park has limited flexibility based on the fact that her father was associated with the former Japanese colonial government. It's a fact, and that reduces her flexibility, and it reduces her ability to maneuver within her own political environment. And it is part and parcel of the reason why there is reduced flexibility substantially on the part of the Republic of Korea. Similarly, I think in the case of Prime Minister Abe, he is his father's son, he's his grandfather's grandson, and we still are a prisoner of attitudes that prevailed in 1945, and that's a fact. And until we get past this period of time, I think it's going to be an uphill slog. And for all of those reasons, and that dynamic that we are a hostage of on both sides, frankly speaking, if we don't do something of the caliber that Kurt is discussing as a possibility, we will continue to see this situation limp along and bump along and be inherently negative in both the near and middle term. I just don't see any option other than a forceful, sustained third-party engagement, a compelled discussion, if you will, on the part of the involved third party and the most capable third party to take action, the United States. But to do that, we would have to really be seen to be invested and have our reputation at risk, our credibility at risk, and be out there. We couldn't be intervening episodically or attempting to set this meeting right or that situation right. This would have to be a dedicated, sustained involvement at the highest levels of the United States, and it would have to be a foreign policy priority.
So, Kurt, since you offered it up, you've put us on this path. Could you continue the discussion and give some more thoughts for all of us here on some of the specifics that you'd like to see? And we get the idea of the shuttle diplomacy, and it's attractive and intriguing. I think it's right. But as you look out at the landscape, what are some of the specific areas, so that we're not just always sitting there talking or writing op-eds and generalities, but we're actually talking about this is where you could make a difference? And I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but is it a particular military issue that we've got going? Is there a particular political issue? And then secondly, what other levers should we be thinking about? So we've talked about, and Nick's talked about, the failure of leadership. Richard's pointed out the restrictions on current leadership. There's got to be other levers out there. What are they? Are they students? Are they journalists? Are they think tank? Who are they? But maybe start us off with some of the specifics that we can grab onto and say, this is where we'd begin that process.
So look, we're all out of government, and we have the luxury of being able to sit up here and speculate. And I would say my own personal advice, if asked, was that the key to getting something like this started is actually in the optics, not in the specifics. And in fact, where you get yourself in trouble is by getting too quickly into specifics about what it exactly are you proposing. And in fact, it's really not at the early stages for the United States to do that. The optic is what my friend Richard suggests, is that we've got to make clear that we're going to take an enormous risk and we're going to put our credibility on the table on behalf of two countries that we love dearly and that we want to see closer together. And we're prepared to sacrifice a degree of our standing in order to make this a success. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second is, I completely agree with this idea. I like very much, in fact, I've liked all the comments. I think it's very high quality. The idea of leadership and what it means. One of the qualities occasionally that is associated with leadership is unlikelihood. People doing things that are unlikely or not anticipated. Who would have ever thought that the man who made his career going after communists at the State Department, communists infiltrating the United States, who had to be fought at every juncture, kind of a wingman of McCarthy, Nixon, would be the person that would go to China? Completely unlikely, right? And so while I accept Richard's general admonition that for a variety of reasons, both Prime Minister Abe and President Park have many things that mitigate against certain kinds of international flexibility, you can also make an argument that leaders like historical movements, particularly when they are strongly encouraged by friends. And so they can say, look, I may not have wanted to do this, but we got these Americans and they're just, you know what they're like, right? It's horrible, but we're going to have to try to figure out a way forward. And so I think that I actually believe if you look at this carefully, there's a lot of ripeness here, to use Richard Haas's terminology. I think deep down, both countries realize that it's quite harmful to their interests. Both would like help, but find it hard to ask for it. Both of them have their closest friend at a distance, which is the United States. We have very robust cooperation beneath the surface. This is not a circumstance where we have very little actually going on. Completely agree with Victor. In fact, the biggest worry that both bureaucracies have in Seoul and Tokyo, particularly in Seoul, is that the profound and deep cooperation with the Japanese in certain areas might be outed in a way that will complicate personal careers. And so I think there's a lot here that says this can be done. And all I would say is, look, everyone gets tired of the rebalance or pivot. No one likes to talk about that. But there is just a recognition here that if we're going to be an effective Asia-Pacific player, we've got to step up our game. I mean, and so rather than we're back, we never left, those are meaningless discussions. If we're going to be effective in Asia, the price of admittance to get in the door has gone up dramatically in 10 years. And we've got to step up our game. It's no more just, look, business as usual. We've got to have major initiatives on the table that are bold, that underscore our values and our interests. I can't think of anything more that underscores our commitment to the future, to both countries, than a clear statement that your fighting has gone on long enough, and it's not in our strategic interests.
So Victor, now to ask you to put on the NSC hat. We started talking earlier, the 70th. There's a lot of concern. We know our friends in Japan have been reaching out to us individually and collectively. Our own colleagues in the State Department have been reaching out. So to pick going forward with what Kurt said here in terms of what the U.S. needs to do to sort of pay entry in a different environment, just thinking about this year and just thinking about basically taking us through August and September, what do you think is the right thing? What do we need to do? Do we get involved with what Japan says? Do we tell them we want to get involved? Do we sit back and see how it evolves? Where over the next 5 months do we put our energies, and for what end?
Well, yeah, we would like to see what Japan is, what sort of statements they're thinking of presenting on the 70th anniversary. I think there'd be a lot of interest in that. I think there should be a consultation mechanism. I mean, whether it's on the history statements between the United States and Japan, and perhaps even informally with the Koreans. I mean, I think that would be a good thing as well. I mean, half of the anger in government or between governments is when people do things and they're not looped in. And so I think it would be very helpful to have that sort of mechanism created. I think it would be also nice to have some sort of, I agree entirely with Kurt, the idea of a collective security statement. I mean, it seems completely rational if you think about the security interests that the countries face. I think that's a big reach in this year, but short of that, even a political declaration of a commonality of interests, common worldview, I think would be helpful. I think it would be helpful for the Koreans to acknowledge the importance of Japan in peninsular defense. And all of us, especially Richard, who know the issue and know the relationship and know the contingencies, know that Japan's support is absolutely critical for defense of the peninsula. If TPP ever gets done, and if the U.S.-Japan agreement ever gets done, it would be great to see Japan supporting the idea of South Korea being one of the first major economies to dock onto TPP after the agreement. I mean, there are lots of things like this. On your earlier question about generational issues, we just hosted an event yesterday with the South Korean head of the South Korean Peace Corps. South Korea has the second largest Peace Corps in the world next to the United States. And I asked him, how much cooperation do you have with JICA? And, it seems to be a very uncontroversial question, but, it caused discomfort because they, at this particular moment, don't want to advertise the sort of cooperation they're doing with Japan in many important transitional areas. I mean, areas that are important to the United States in terms of transitional countries. So this sort of out-of-area cooperation, I think, is another area where the two countries can cooperate. I mean, I think, for many countries in East Asia, they cooperate much better out of the region than they do in the region. And so I think there are lots of opportunities there on the development side, development assistance side, and also that bring in a younger generation of people with a spirit of volunteerism. So, there's so many positive elements that you could push towards in terms of the relationship, but I think for the reasons that Richard mentioned, it's difficult. I would also say, in front of all these cameras, that the media doesn't help either, right? Whether it's in Korea or in Japan, I guess sort of the antagonism sells papers these days, and that's not very helpful either. We've done some polling actually of the South Korean public, as have other organizations that find, in our poll we asked the South Korean voters to sort of rank how important certain issues are in terms of their evaluation of their own government, right? And so we put everything out there, right? And obviously, unsurprisingly, economic issues was the number one issue. When we talked about history, this was like 9 or 10, right? It wasn't 2 or 3. It was like 9 or 10. And so it's the politicians, it's the media that feel like they must behave this way because that's what the public wants. But, for the average person, I don't think this is certainly not how they rank the performance of their government, what position they take on these historical issues. So, and I would imagine that's the case in Japan as well. So,
Thank you. We're going to open it up to questions in just a minute. I want to give Nick a chance to jump in on any of these issues, and then we're going to go to you guys.
You asked earlier, Misha, about the rising generations in South Korea and in Japan. And I read the public opinion polls and all that sort of biz. And I don't track this stuff from month to month, or even from 18 months to 18 months. But I'd suggest that more or less nowadays, the level of, what would you call it, affinity or comfort or familiarity or tolerance for ordinary young people in South Korea and ordinary young people in Japan is more or less at an all-time high. I mean, and you can track this in greater or lesser measure through the popularity of K-pop in Japan and Japanese movies and culture in Korea and other things. So this tension between the two governments is sort of in paradoxical contraposition to a person-to-person level of affinity, which I think opens up the possibility for the sort of breakthroughs that some of the rest of us have been discussing. One other thing about young people and anybody younger than me is young, right? So one thing about younger people in the ROK today, and I'm particularly thinking about the under 40 generation, this is the first group of Koreans, more or less in history, who haven't experienced huge sacrifices and huge uncertainties and huge privations. So the whole question of what happens when leadership makes a call that may summon up the notion of heroic ambitions or heroic sacrifices is a real one.
It's a great point. And one thing that's interesting is you talked about, all of you have talked about that issue of leadership and the necessity of leadership. Nick, you talked about that post-war period. And you've also raised the fact that, and I think it's absolutely right, the affinity and the cultural affinity from soap operas to food to the fact that, when I first went to Japan in the early 90s, there was no hangul on the train stations and the subway stations. Now it's there. It's the number one vacation and tourist spot of either side. You go into Seoul and it's filled with Japanese, which is the inverse of what we saw in Europe. I don't know if when Adenauer and de Gaulle were putting together the political relationship in the 50s and 60s, if Germans were listening to Edith Piaf and the French were thinking about the glories of German. Whatever it is they'd be thinking about. So there is an inverse here. Can you build from that relationship and seed in the political? So we've got some good ideas on the table. We have some very good ideas that we all may see come to fruition in not too long.
You're a historian. Can I ask you a question before we go into this?
Sure, and then we'll get to. I know Chris is just itching, so I'm going to get over to him in a second.
A historian is a terrible thing to waste. So, and you are an expert on you were an eminent expert on Japanese history. So, through your historical lens, we know that all international politics is domestic, really. But are you surprised by where Japanese domestic politics is in the ROK today, looking through the broader sweep of post-war relations?
Well, I think it goes back in part to this question of where we haven't seen that trend line go up the way we want. Instead, we're at this bad point of Seoul fatigue or Korea fatigue, which I don't think you saw in Japan for a very long time. I mean, what I would pick up was hope. Sometimes hope that seemed forlorn and unrequited, obviously, but there was hope that they would move beyond. In part because Japan wanted to play that leadership role, may have seen itself, as the head of the flock of flying geese, but understood that Korea was central because of the alliance with the U.S., but also a Korea that was rapidly modernizing and growing. And there was a Japan that thought that this would be the natural evolution if some of the leading countries were picking a democratic path and there was one other major country that was not, then this would be a natural evolution to come together. One of the reasons I wanted to do this panel was real worry that the Japanese may be giving up on that hope. I don't know if they are, but a deep concern that what you have is an ingrained pessimism that says we tried. We tried with people who were sympathetic to Korea. We tried with people who may not be so sympathetic to Korea. It doesn't matter. We're not getting where we want to be. Now we have to look for alternatives. And I think in some way you see that with what Abe is doing. And I think you see Abe, particularly at Shangri-La, which I thought if you haven't read his Shangri-La speech, I would recommend going and reading it. It is a fairly comprehensive setting out of what he sees as an alternative political and security vision for the region, with Japan playing a major role, offering support, offering friendship to countries that it either has had a traditional relationship with or new countries, but he doesn't talk about South Korea. That's not in that vision right now. That's what worries me, is that you're seeing not blocks, but you're seeing the giving up of the sense that we're going to get something that should be a natural Northeast Asian core here, and instead it becomes even more of a zero-sum game. So thank you, Nick, for that. We got to turn to you guys because we know we got tons of questions. So we're going to have a mic come around. Just please let us know who you are and then ask a brief question. Got about 25 minutes for questions. We are going to start with Chris.
Thanks. Chris Nelson, the Nelson Report. Always positive media here. A quick anecdote and then a more specific question. Nick, I rarely disagree with you, and I'm not sure I can disagree, but this is an important anecdote. My daughter Margot just got back from her second tour of teaching English in South Korea. In between 5 years, she was Jerry Connolly's caseworker, so she's a Washington gal. She was horrified to discover this time, just got back a month ago, that when she would give an independent writing assignment to her 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds, as often as not, it would come back about those Japs. Not the singers, not the anime, not all this personal stuff that we all hang our hat on, but this Japan writ large history. And Margaret said, these are 6-year-olds. They're getting it from mom and dad. They're getting it from grandpa. It is absolutely being kept alive today with the rising generation. The generation after you and I are long gone have been taught by their families, you can't trust these guys. That is a hell of a problem, and it goes way beyond rock and roll and anime. So that's just my story. My question, and you guys have heard me ask Sun Kim at least twice recently in public forums, what the hell are we going to do about this? Isn't it time to do all the things you guys are recommending? And his response each time has been, the U.S. does not have a mediation role here. Well, and that's the word. Well, you guys have just explained at great length and a terrific panel why not only do we have a mediation role, we got to do it. So my question is, we know certain things are going to take place fairly quickly. The Prime Minister of Japan, your friend Abe and mine, is going to be here towards the end of April. He's going to give a speech. Whether Speaker Boehner gives him a joint session or something, he's going to give a big speech. The speech writer was here recently, and I'm sure you met with him as I did. And the model they're going to use is the Canberra speech. In the Canberra speech, Abe specifically mentioned 2 horrendous Australian equivalents of the Bataan Death March and that kind of thing. All right. So we talked about, okay, what are you going to talk about here? Yes, Bataan Death March, but then what else? And I had some suggestions. Among them was, you embrace Lester Tenney or something, But my question is, what is, in terms of U.S. mediation and expectations and saying what we want, and this is something that Kurt, I know, has been involved in for almost 3 years, is it time for us to specifically say exactly what we think about certain history aspects? And specifically, do we insist to the Prime Minister that embracing Murayama and embracing Kono in general terms is important, but if you drop specifics, if you drop key words, it's like messing with one China. People parse every syllable of what you say. So if you don't use the key words, embracing doesn't cut it. This is going to happen basically a month from now. God knows where we're going to be in August. So it is perhaps the first step in U.S. mediation is a much closer, active NSC involvement with the contact in the Prime Minister's office on what he's going to say here, and very specific. So sorry for a speech, but it's a question at the end of it.
Thank you, Chris. Always interesting and provocative. Look, I know those dialogues are ongoing with the U.S. government and the Japanese government about how to be most successful in handling the next several months. I will say, just by and by, language really matters, and so I don't think what we are describing or what I have described is mediation. I don't think that's appropriate. I think this is really facilitation, which is a very different concept. We're facilitating an important dialogue between two close friends. And I think we have a historical terminology and a anxiety about the risks of this particular role. And I would simply say I probably would have bought on to many of those concerns 2 or 3 years ago when we were at the very early stages of this. But now that it is metastasized and really spread into the fabric of the relationship, I don't think we can be as comforted by this idea that it will be misperceived or that, somehow we will, kind of risk, putting each of these relationships on the rocks. I think there is a different approach and a different conceptualization, which is basically to make clear much more publicly and directly that this ongoing set of affairs is hurting the United States, hurting our role in Asia. And I think basically what we could do is make this part of a larger strategic vision of what we're trying to accomplish in Asia, part of which has to do with TPP, part of which has to do with dealing with China in a new period, part of it has to do what's our vision for allies, a comprehensive approach to what we want to accomplish and what we want to do in Asia. At the core of that has to be an improving relationship between Japan and South Korea.
Along the same lines, Chris, I guess, first of all, my comments about the coming events of the next few months was more just noting that it is going to be potentially a turbulent period that we have to get through. But irrespective of what plays out, and by the way, I don't think sideline coaching is going to work. I think that it is not well received by either side. We have people that on both sides that are circumscribed and limited what they can do and what they want to do and what they will do, and that coaching, mediating without direct leadership engagement doesn't work. It's that simple. And we're going to have a period ahead of us that has to be managed to the degree that it can be managed. But that said, there's another aspect here, and that is when we attempt to do something like this, we have to have a plan to do it, and what we plan to do must be explained and agreed from a policy perspective to be what is in the best interest of the United States of America. Not what's in the best interest of our dear friend the Koreans, not what's in best interest of the China-Korea relationship, or for that matter, Japan. What is in our national interest? And the point that Kurt is making and the others on this panel are making, I believe, is we've reached the point in this relationship that we can no longer tolerate, for the interests of the United States of America, the disputes that are going on between these two countries. It's time to get it over with. It's past time. So we have to be proactive and do what's best for America. And if that means heavy-handed engagement and facilitation, or whatever we want to call it, that's what we have to do now. Left unattended, this situation is going to get worse. It's not going to get better. And the political dynamic in the region is changing. You have China, you have Russia, revanchist Russia. You have issues that are cooking with the United States of America, with Korea, for example, the bilateral nuclear agreement, the fuel cycle issue. All of these issues are upon us, or will soon be upon us and can't be avoided. We have no choice but to get more engaged.
Well, the last point that Richard made was what I was going to say, because listening to Kurt and to Richard and everybody on the panel, I mean, we're not doing this because it's for the South Koreans. I mean, we can't pivot to Asia if we don't have Japan and Korea with us. It's just as simple as that. And the relationship has become such that it's difficult to do that. Chris's point on the younger generation, that's really disturbing to hear, actually, because if we think about how this is going to be resolved in the longer term, and the difference between Europe and Asia is that in both Korea and Japan, it is still not seen as domestically legitimate to be in favor of good relations between Japan and Korea. It's just not there, and that's where the younger generation can play a role, by creating that sort of norm within society, that sort of political norm. And so that's quite discouraging to hear.
Other questions?
Thank you very much. Bing Ru Wang with Hong Kong Phoenix TV. Dr. Campbell, if shadow diplomacy is more often used between the United States partners and semi-partners, can it apply to Japan, between Japan and China? And what are the main differences between United States and Japan that really concerned you? Thank you.
I mean, the concept of diplomacy does not simply mean engaging countries in which you have antithetical interests. In fact, I think that is a profound misreading about what diplomacy is all about. In fact, some of the most important diplomacy is to ensure that things are going right with friends. So I don't think there are many other issues that are more important than this, personally. And I would simply say one of the most important things in this process is to make clear at the outset publicly how much you respect and admire and trust and value both relationships. I think that there has to be an understanding in both Seoul and Tokyo that this springs from the deepest respect and admiration of both countries, but also recognition that something has gone badly wrong and that must be fixed.
Back here at the table, straight back. If you could raise your hand so they know. Yes, sir, you.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Steinfeld. I'm a Foreign Service officer, currently Foreign Policy Advisor to Chairman Dempsey. It's mainly for you, Kurt. I'm curious, you all haven't spent a lot of time talking about China and all of this, and I'm just wondering, your specific idea, Kurt, to do more to bring Japan and Korea together, and keeping in mind your notion, although some of you said that there's an increasing view in Washington that Korea is slipping into a Chinese orbit. Kurt, you welcomed, from the U.S. point of view, a stronger South Korea-China relationship. If were we to get involved in something of your what you suggested about doing more, how would that be seen in Beijing? How would you explain it to Beijing? Is it not inevitable that China would just see it as the U.S. trying to form a stronger trilateral alliance against them?
Look, I think I would be very transparent and open with Beijing about why these are our two closest friends historically in Asia, and that this is perfectly natural, A. B, that we would ask for China's public support in this, and in fact, we would hope that this would be the first stage in what we would think would be an improving relationship between Japan and China, second. And third, I think we should be very clear publicly how much we welcome an improving relationship between South Korea and China. And I'm very much with Victor. I do not believe what we have seen is about a South Korea that is seeking a different political and strategic orientation. I would simply just subtly add to Victor's point. I think there are two considerations that are at play here in South Korea. One is the North Korea dimension, and second is the economic dimension. There is a dramatic recognition in South Korea that both competition and opportunity is presented by both Chinese manufacturing and the Chinese market. This is Madam Park's attempt to engage on both issues constructively. I think we welcome that. I think the way we welcome it and encourage it will only strengthen the relationship between South Korea and the United States. I do not believe that China would publicly want to be seen to be blocking an improving relationship between two friends in the region, and I don't see any problems here in that regard.
Thank you very much. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. And the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has extended the invitation to all the leaders of the relative countries to join the 70th anniversary of commemoration. And I don't believe President Obama will go. But do you think the U.S. senior officials should attend this ceremony? Do you believe President Park should join in the ceremony? And the second question is particularly for Secretary Campbell. And last week, the Undersecretary Sherman talked about a lot about the security architecture in Northeast Asia when she made a speech in Carnegie Endowment. If I'm not making a mistake, I remember you also raised the similar architecture in East Asia. So what's your takes on that issue right now? Thank you.
Should President Park attend? Should senior U.S. officials attend?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there were going to be a lot of ceremonies this year, and you know, I mean, I think, you know, I don't think that at least from what I've seen from the Korea vantage point, I don't think some of the things that China has said and done on the history issue have been helpful. And so if it's a conversation about moving forward, sure, I think people should go. But if it's a conversation just about rehashing the past and saying, you know, all of us are going to keep our historic thumbs on Japan, then I don't think that's helpful.
I do want to associate myself with some on the panel that talk about this period as a period that has to be gotten through. And to recognize, I have to say this, just the profound differences in how both Europe and the Pacific and Asia remember and celebrate these events. And so I think some of you probably had a similar experience. So I was in government. I was at the Defense Department during the 50th anniversary ceremonies that were held in Hawaii. And previously, I had had the chance to go with the president to those in Europe, and they were just night and day, right? The celebrations in Europe were really around manicured cemeteries and war fields that had basically been cultivated in a way to remind everyone about how things had been put in an appropriate historical context. If you go to any of the battlefields in Asia, in Peleliu or any of the islands, it's like they stopped fighting and just dropped their equipment. And I mean, live ammunition is laying all around, right? It's like it's still with us. And the 50th anniversary in Hawaii was one of the most tense affairs I can recall. And we were up all night long for a week in advance trying to figure out exactly what Prime Minister Murayama would say. My own personal view is very close to what Victor says. I think there is a kind of ceremony and recognition here that is profound and deep, that understands the enormous sacrifices and the terrible costs associated with this war. And I think it's a little bit like art. You're going to kind of know it when you see it. And I hope that there will be those events that people will feel are appropriate in their solemnity and how they reflect on what has transpired, how it shaped all of us. But the other hope is that people will recognize that it set the stage for, again, I like Nick's post-war era, which is unprecedented in its creation of wealth and maintenance of peace and stability, that have to be celebrated simultaneously. And so I'd love to see that play out in a way that is effective. I hope that in this process, and I'll just conclude with this, we've all talked about what it is that needs to be said in Japan or South Korea, it is also the case that the United States has a lot to say here as well. And so the speeches that emanate from the United States, from the president and others, will be equally significant. And I hope that we will be able to put this in the appropriate context and send a message of both remembrance and hope that will have some resonance for a region that is quite disquieted by much of this. Richard?
First of all, everything that Kurt said about what's before us here in the next few months is just, I can't understate the importance of how the leadership of these countries manage the next few months and manage the events themselves. And I believe some of this comes back to Japan, of course. Much of it comes back to how the Korean government manages things. How China manages the event that it has called and it has invited people to. It has either an opportunity here, as Kurt mentioned, to say the right things and say them in the right way, and it also has an opportunity, if it chooses to use this in a pejorative way or a negative way. And I think this is a call that, of course, China has to make, but all eyes will be focused on how China manages this event and to what end it puts its remarks in its activities in the run-up to the event itself and in the event. And that will determine probably who goes to that event and how they participate. I don't want to make too big of an issue of the 2 September ceremony, but again, it will conclude a period of a strain period that we all have to manage very carefully, and that includes the Chinese as well as the United States and Japan and Republic of Korea.
We have time. I'm going to take 2 questions so we can get them on the table. We're going to go back here and then up to the lady over here. So at the back table and then up here. If you can put your questions out on the table, and then we'll get our panelists to answer. Thank you.
Well, you might need to hear a Japanese voice. So I like to make
Just for a question though, because we only have a few minutes left. So if you have the question, then please ask the panel. But otherwise, we'll just have to take a question at this point in time. Thank you.
Well, the question is the question to the very premise of the whole gathering. Simply put, what's wrong with the continuation of the current status with regard to the relations between South Korea and Japan? Acrimonious as they are, they seem to be on the surface. I think the fundamental components of relations, as some of the panelists indicated, I think is pretty solid in terms of contingency or the real crisis. I think the security cooperation between South Korea and Japan, I think will materialize. That's my view. So why the fuss? I mean,
The first question is why the fuss? Second question, and then we'll go this young lady.
Excuse me. Okay. Thanks for your enlightening discussion. Jennifer, reporter with SZMG. We know the foreign ministers of China, South Korea, and Japan are preparing for the upcoming meeting later this month for the first time in 3 years. So what's your take on the potential breakthrough among the 3 countries? And what's your predictions or suggestions about the comfort women issue solving in upcoming meeting? Thanks.
Okay, so we have a first provocative question. What's the fuss? Why have we wasted an hour and a half is really the subtext of the question. And the second question is about the upcoming 3-party meeting. So whoever would like to jump in on that, please.
I just want to answer, and thank you for the question. So imagine a set of circumstances. I completely agree with you that we have very robust arenas of cooperation across the board between Japan and South Korea. I will tell you, and those of us like you who travel in the region regularly, in most conversations with South Korean friends, when one of these aspects of cooperation comes up, they will invariably say, please do not discuss this in public. Because if it's discussed in public, it will be ended immediately, right? Or curtailed, or put on the side burner for a period of time. ultimately, that is profoundly unhealthy. In a democracy, your population has to know what your country's involved in and engaged with in terms of its foreign policy, national security, and intelligence operations. And so I do believe there is substantial harm being done. I also think that much of this is, look, there are all countries have our better and lesser better selves. And they require constant vigilance and recognition that these issues have to be attended to. And if they're not, a certain laziness creeps in and a tendency to revert to the negative. And so I appreciate what you're saying, but I couldn't dismiss it more, because I heard the same thing 2 or 3 years ago, that this is short-lived, it's not that deep, it won't continue. If you get involved in the United States, you're just going to risk your own relationship, your reputations. 3 years later, right? 3 years later, you have a South Korean leader saying, I will meet at any time without preconditions with the North Korean leader. But I can't imagine a set of circumstances where I can meet with a Japanese leader. You've got a Japanese leader and his team that is, quote, quote, exhausted by South Korea, right? You're not exhausted by one of your partners and friends, right? So I really think there are things that have crept into the fabric of the relationship that, if they continue, will have deep, profound, long-term damage. And even though it may not be immediately understood, the totality of it is enormously harmful to both countries. But more importantly, and this gets back to the point that Richard said, this is harmful to us. It's harmful to the United States. Can't rebalance, can't pivot without mending this. And so the idea of letting it go on without it somehow hurting the United States is just wrong. It's an assessment that I think, if allowed to really be debated, I think you could defeat that motion handily.
Very quickly, I'm going to associate myself totally with Kurt's comments. It does matter. It isn't just a superficial issue. As someone that was involved at least a few years ago in the contingency planning that you alluded to, there are things that have to be put right. They have not been put right in both relationships and in bilateral cooperation between the two countries. We can't go on the way it is. It just simply doesn't work. And if we don't see a timeline for resolving this and getting it right, both the Republic of Korea and Japan will be net losers in that situation. And with regard to the comment on the 3 foreign ministers meeting that's upcoming, I think in that meeting they could do no harm and no greater good than to just talk and agree among the 3 of them how they're jointly going to manage the next 6 months of engagement, publicly and privately, but especially publicly.
2 quick points. First, I always love it when the Chinese Communist Party faults Japan for its bad history. I don't think that there's any country in Asia, apart perhaps from North Korea, which has as big a history problem as China. Secondly, paradoxically, the ROK-Japan history quarrel is itself a sort of a holiday from history. It reeks of interwar politics. Big boys keep their eyes on the prize.
Well, on the question of status quo, I mean, for 70 years, the U.S. System in Asia has been based on these very strong alliances with Japan and Korea, and this sort of alignment between Seoul and Tokyo. And that alignment is fraying. It's very obvious that it's fraying. And that to the extent that one considers what the United States has done in Asia to be successful, could not have been successful without this trilateral relationship. And as Richard and I were saying, it's dysfunctional right now, completely dysfunctional. And when you see little things, I mean, little things like the press report about the changing of the description of Korea on the Foreign Ministry website, or other sorts of small things like that, the excluding of South Korean speeches by the Prime Minister. I mean, these are signs that the status quo is not okay, and that it's headed in a very bad direction. I think that's one of the reasons why you did this panel. On the comfort woman issue, again, it's very difficult, very emotional issue. I personally don't think that Abe will say the wrong thing on comfort women. I think that he will make the appropriate statements. But the real question, as Richard said, is, so instead of focusing on the statement, what are we going to do beyond that? Like, how is everybody going to react, and what's the plan going forward, among the countries? I mean, this has to be a topic of very proactive discussion, and not something that's simply left to the winds of reactions in media and politicians and others.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I think at AEI, like all think tanks, we like to believe we're Lake Wobegon and all of our events are above average. But this one clearly was, and I think there were important things said here that should be listened to in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Beijing, and other places, and you will and Washington, and you will continue to hear the positions of our distinguished panelists make their way into the policy discussion over the coming years. So thank you for coming, and please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you, Misha.